And 2, conflict.
One thing that's always stood out for me about Stockport has been its war history. I went to the War Memorial in Stockport, across from the wedding cake, November 2014. In that huge cathedral of memorial, hearing Mike Garrick reading the names of the Stockport men who were killed in the First World War. Over 2,000 names. Every one a life, a family member killed far from home, really bore down on the tragedy and loss. And then, in January this year, seeing the statue only recently erected on Mount Tabor of one of the cockleshell heroes, the wartime Royal Marines who attacked shipping in canoes, James Conway. He was a milkman from Edgeley. He was only 19 when he was killed, captured and tortured, then executed as a spy. You don't think of an ordinary local lad being caught up in something like that.
2 Stockport lads were awarded Victoria Crosses in the First World War. A VC was awarded to Joseph Lister and another to Wilfred Wood, a railway employee. There's a blue plaque to him in Stockport Station foyer. He had a locomotive and a pub, the Wilfred Wood in Hazel Grove, named after him.
My dad's first ever memory was being in the cellar on Lowfield Road when the air raid sirens were going off. And on his road there was a house that was actually bombed. You can see I was different from the other houses now. That's his first memory because he was a war baby. He was only about 3, but he remembers. My granddad was in the war and his nickname was the Cat because they all thought he had 9 lives. He had that many close scrapes. It was amazing that he lived and my mum lived and we're here. He told me one story where a shell went off and it blew him over the top of a cliff. And just below the edge of the cliff was the remains of a tree trunk and he fell onto it and then came back over. And then he was walking across rubble in Italy, I think it was, and there was absolutely nothing left of this house. Then he saw just this little bit of brown wood that was shining and he thought, what is that? And he lifted it up and it was a carving of Jesus. Now, whether you're religious or not, it was the only thing left of the whole thing. And my mum still got it. Everything else was destroyed apart from this carving.
I lived in Edgeley during the last war, and we heard the doodle book going over. And when the motor stopped, I got pushed under the table. What was that going to do when a doodle book fell? It wasn't an IKEA table, it was a real table. But all the kids went under the table. But it came down on a house in Garner's Lane. Demolished the house, but there was no one in, fortunately. But we heard the motor stop somewhere over Edgeley. A part of the Manchester Blitz, I think. And this was a sort of a stray. My birthday occurred about the time of the Manchester Blitz. And we were going down to the Anderson shelter. And my brother said, "Hey, Jack." He was older than me, my brother, but daft as a brush, but older. And he said to me, "Jack, Mr. Goering sent you some fireworks for your birthday." And I loved Mr. Goering for years. I did. Mr. Goering, Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. And then some bugger spoiled it. And he said, "Mr. Goering's a bugger. Santa Claus is dead. And they've had the Easter Bunny in a casserole." So I had to grow up.
My granddad told me when he did national service during the Cold War to create an army to protect us from the creeping Russians, except those desperate for education or apprenticeship or vital industry reasons, everyone was called up. They had to go to different training camps around the country, depending on the service they were in. Army, Navy, Air Force. They had 48-hour passes and 72-hour passes, but there wasn't sufficient time to do the journeys by train, so coaches came from the areas where camps were. Local companies to the camps would run coaches to pick up people in Birmingham, Manchester, Stockport. And so on a Sunday night, they had to be back in camp for Monday morning. The place would be milling with soldiers, sailors and airmen in Mersey Square in Stockport. All the boys of 18 were of great interest to the girls. So Mersey Square was just full of weeping girls and young men standing and sitting on plaza steps with girls in their arms.
We used to go down into Mersey Square by what we call the Plaza Steps. We saw one little boy having a pee in the gutter. My father just said as he walked past, "Aim straight, laddie."
I was born in 1932, during the war. We had a lot of American GIs billeted around the area, particularly around Poynton. My father, he became a golf professional at Stockport Golf Club, and he was able to see the explosions as the bombs fell. Incendiaries. They're getting it in Liverpool tonight, or Manchester's getting it tonight.
My father. Well, I'm here because of Hitler. He's got a lot to answer for. The reason I say that is because because the shelters in Stockport. My father was born in Chorlton-cum-Hardy, and he got very badly bombed, to the extent that they all got bombed out. He lost a couple of kids in the bombing. And they'd heard about these shelters in Stockport, and so he basically walked with all the prams and all the possessions they had and everything, and they lived in the shelters for 3 or 4 weeks until they found somewhere else. So that's the reason why my father settled in Stockport. And without him, obviously, I wouldn't be here. So thanks to Hitler, when the council came to prepare the shelters before the war broke out, they found people were already living in parts of the caves, which are now the air raid shelters. You could get in from Turner's Vaults. You know where the bridge over is? You could go straight through to Brinksway, the Chestergate Hotel. They had everything there. Kitchens, beds, flushing toilets, first aid stations, nurses, wardens for when people got out of hand. There's 2 tours you can go on. There's one that you can go on if you have a chat with the council. And you can go on a tour which takes you around the back. You have to wear a hard hat. See how the local people live.
I served in the Royal Navy. In 1985, I was on board a ship serving in the Persian Gulf. We were there to escort British shipping to the oil terminals in Kuwait. Iran and Iraq were at that time engaged in hostilities with each other, which is why we were there. Before going out to the Gulf, the ship had to go through 6 weeks of intense training, covering all scenarios possible in a potential war zone. Part of that training was to close up to battle stations. This was preceded by 2 alarms going off, and once they sounded, all 250 men on board had to go from a normal cruising state to being battle ready, with weaponry active and the ship in a state where it could deal with any threat. In training, this took the ship's company 56 seconds, a praiseworthy time according to the staff evaluating our readiness for the role. Some weeks later, we were in the Gulf. Just before lunch, the ship was getting ready for a watch changeover. Men were eating prior to going on watch, and those on watch were preparing handover briefs. Then the alarm sounded. An unknown aircraft had buzzed us. From that point on, it got strange, and I can only recount my own personal perceptions. I've never been as focused as I was at that point, when potentially my life and the lives of the other 249 crew depended on the next seconds, minutes, who knew. I had headphones on with an external radio circuit in one ear and an internal comm circuit in the other. Both exploded as data was frantically collated. I was dimly aware of the missile men rushing into position on the anti-aircraft console behind me. My training kicked in. I was processing data and reporting back. I could hear my controller liaising with command personnel. I felt the floor beneath me shudder and vibrate as the ship removed the war breakers on the engines and increased to a combat speed. The gun crews on the upper deck reported in closed up. The ship reported it was now airtight against gas or chemical attack. Damage control, firefighting, medical parties all reported in. The missile system was live and locked on to target. 250 men had reacted as one. There was a collective holding of breath. In my head, I could hear the opening of Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1. We were waiting for the command that would either plunge us into conflict or release us from this incredible state of readiness. Reports came back. The aircraft was flying away from us. We waited. If he began to turn, we would have shot him down. My world stopped. After an eternity, the report came in. The aircraft had continued straight on. We could stand down. We breathed again. That whole incident And all the events I described, from the alarms to the order to stand down, took place in under a minute. The ship beat its training time to close up. We were ready to kill that unknown pilot in 32 seconds. After my relief for the afternoon reported for his watch, I went to lunch. After lunch, some 3/4 of an hour after stand down, I sat in the mess deck with a mug of tea and physically shook for over an hour as the enormity of what I'd been a part of and what could have happened hit home. That incident was a near miss. We never fired a shot, but I can still recall that incident in detail now after over 30 years. The brave young men and women who currently serve are, and those who served in the past were, plunged into combat almost daily. The effect must be on them. I can only begin to imagine.